Hello everybody, welcome to my history class. This is probably the first video you're going to be watching, and the reason for this is we're going to talk a little bit about what history is, and how we do history, and different approaches you can take to understanding the past. In this video, you are going to learn about a couple key terms like primary source, secondary source, interpretation, historical narrative, and bias. And we're also going to be asking some key questions that we're going to talk about more in class tomorrow. Stuff like, what is history? How do historians construct historical narratives? What does it mean for a source to be biased? And what are the different types of history, and what sorts of evidence do they look at? So that's the stuff we're going to be talking about in this video. You should be able to answer all these questions and define all of these key terms by the time you're finished with this video. So it might be wise to maybe have your notes out and to write these questions down and to answer them as we go along. Or maybe you'd like to wait until the end and then try to answer all of them after you pay close attention to the video. It's up to you. All right, so let's get started by talking about how history gets made. So history, you might think, is just whatever has happened, right? But I would argue that history is something different than that. History is not just all the random stuff that happens, but history is a story that we as people tell ourselves about what has happened. And now those two can be very different. You can make up a story that's totally false, and that would still be history. I would argue, though, that it's bad history. So, as historians nowadays, what we are trying to do is to understand the past and to tell ourselves a true story about how we got here and what has happened so far in human history. So, historians, people like me, attempt to base their understanding of the past on evidence. If we don't have evidence for something, we basically shouldn't believe it. That's one of the basic rules in history. So what kinds of evidence can historians use to build their understanding? Some of the main forms of evidence that we're going to be looking at in this class are things like archaeological remains. That would be stuff like old ruins or ancient campfires or dead bodies or graves, other stuff like that. Basically anything that they leave behind by accident. Also, written records. These are maybe the most important. So once people discover writing, history all of a sudden has lots and lots more evidence because we can read the actual ideas of the people who wrote them. Art and architecture are going to be very important. They oftentimes will give us a window into the values of a society. Just imagine what our art and stuff like our TV shows and movies say about us and what historians of the future will say about our generation. And of course, I guess I already talked about this, audio and video recordings, which only become important in modern history. So all of this historical evidence that comes directly from whatever society that we're trying to study is called a primary source. So if I wanted to study, let's say, ancient Greece, I would look at primary sources, and primary sources would be stuff that the ancient Greeks actually made or left behind themselves. So if an ancient Greek wrote something down and I read it, I could use that to understand the past, and I would be using a primary source to understand the past. All of history is ultimately based on primary sources, or at least good history is. So historians, their main job is to interpret primary sources. And so they basically look at all of these sources and they decide what these sources actually tell us. Interpretation is the process of deciding the meaning of a historical source. So historical sources don't just tell you automatically what they mean. You actually have to read into them and interpret them to figure out what they tell us. And based on these interpretations, historians attempt to create a narrative, that is, a story about what happened in the past. So we look at all of these different primary sources, we interpret them, we put them together, and we try to create a story that makes sense about what has happened. And so all of these narratives and all of these interpretations are known as secondary sources. Secondary sources which are based on primary sources, are created by historians in order to understand the past. So now we have to look at one of the biggest problems that historians face, and this is the problem of bias. So, as we talked about in the last slide, historians are trying to build a narrative that is more or less true about what has happened in the past by looking at sources. The problem, though, is that all sources, primary or secondary, are created by a particular person or group for a particular reason. And because of this, they might distort the truth about what was actually going on, either by accident or on purpose. And so let's look at some examples of how sources might distort reality. So one example, consider a Nike commercial and what it does or does not tell you about how basketball shoes or other sports equipment work. Is this an accurate depiction of what basketball shoes actually do? Look at this ad here. I don't actually know what brand of shoe that's for, but the brand is basically, or the picture is actually telling you that basically if you buy these shoes, it's like wearing springs, you'll be able to jump higher and be better at basketball. Is that actually true? Can we trust this advertisement? Obviously, the answer is no. The advertisement is trying to sell us shoes, so it's basically lying to us to convince us that these basketball shoes do something in particular. So if we were trying to write a history of the development of, athletic footwear, we would have to be careful about this source because it would mislead us and give us a false idea about how this kind of basketball shoe actually worked. Secondary sources can also be biased, so we have to be careful when we're reading secondary sources because they might give us a false idea about what has actually happened. And so you have to think about who is writing your history book. So for example, if you were reading a history book, a history of, let's say, a history of Germany written by Adolf Hitler, we would want to be careful because we know that he had some pretty awful ideas and some pretty strange ways of thinking about the world, and that these ideas might bias the way that he understands the world. So as we looked at what he thought, we would have to be careful to think about what was actually going on versus what he was saying was going on. The source would be bias. And so bias is just any time that a source is distorted or gives us a distorted view about the past. And so historians, when they are looking at all of these different sources, if they want to come up with an accurate understanding of the past, they need to be careful to identify the bias of the sources that they're using. That way you don't accidentally take in these false ideas and build them into your own historical narrative. And so we'll look more at this problem of bias later, but it's just important that you know that this is a huge issue, and that everybody has some kind of bias. Me, you, your history textbook, and we as historians need to be careful as we go forward and construct our own narratives. Last of all, I'd like to talk about a couple of the different types of history. So most historians focus on one way of understanding the past. And how you can understand the past in all sorts of different ways, and this will affect what sorts of evidence you focus on. There are all sorts of different ways that you can understand a society or that society's history. You can look at warfare, you could look at people's beliefs, you could look at laws that people passed to govern their society. And so some historians like to focus on politics. This is called political history, and most history was done this way for a long time. And so political historians are going to focus on evidence that deals with the type of government, how different countries related to one another, the laws that they passed, and also military events, so battles and generals and stuff like that. That's political history. But in the last 50 or maybe 100 years, Other types of history have come up that are also very important for how we understand the past today. The first one, and one of the biggest ones, is economic history. So economics is where you look at how stuff is made and the systems of money and production. So like, where is all the stuff in the society coming from? Who is making the stuff? Who is selling the stuff? Who is becoming rich? Who is poor? Stuff like that. And so economic history, a lot of people think, is maybe even more important for understanding the rise and fall of different societies, because a society's political power, its ability to fight wars or pass laws or conquer other people, is oftentimes determined by how much money it has, right? So we need to understand economics as well as politics. Social history is another big one that has become more important in recent years. And what this looks at is, it looks more at how the society was structured. Who in the society has all the control? Who is poor? How do the poor people and the rich people relate to each other? It also looks at the way normal people lived their lives. So instead of looking at great people like great conquerors or presidents, it looks at how normal people lived and tries to understand society by studying normal patterns of behavior. It also looks at changes in population over time, and where people move throughout the country. And last of all, and I guess I'll go ahead and tell you my bias, my favorite, is intellectual and cultural history. And so intellectual and cultural history attempts to understand the past by focusing on new ideas and discoveries, changes in beliefs, so like changes in religious ideas or ideas about how government should work, and also on how people, what people believe is normal behavior. So what you are or are not allowed to do in a given society. And this is important because a lot of times the economic history or the political history or the social history of a society, the laws they make or the stuff they buy or the way they live their lives, is determined by the ideas that they have about the world. And so intellectual and cultural historians believe that by studying ideas and beliefs and religions, you can understand the fundamental reasons for why a society does or does not do something. Of course, a good historian is going to look at all of these different types of evidence and try to understand the past in terms of politics, economics, society, and culture. So we're going to try in this course to put all of this together to give you a comprehensive idea about what was going on during the human past. So I hope you're excited about this. That's all I've got for you today. See you tomorrow.